Welcome to 10 Minute Climate, the podcast brought to you by Beaverbrook Energy. Join Max.
Hi, I'm Max.
And Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony.
Who between them have got over 70 years of experience in the energy industry, and they're here to share it with you. It's everything you need to know, delivered in just 10 minutes. So let's get started.
Why does electricity cost so much money?
Yeah, well, there are a few reasons which we can go into. I think the first thing that everyone's got to understand is it's kind of what you're blessed with, okay? Where you are. We talked about Iceland in a previous episode. They have very cheap power.
Natural resources.
Yeah, natural resources.
Yeah.
Geothermal. They have in Iceland. It makes it very cheap. In America, they've got a lot of very cheap gas. It makes it very cheap there. Germany has not much. It's got some cheap coal, but it depends on
rubbish coal
imports. France has a legacy of building a lot of nuclear plants back in the day, and they're now sweating those assets. They, at the moment, don't need to build a new fleet, but it means that they've got cheap power. Spain, in the middle of the day, has got a lot of sun, so they have cheap power. So it starts with where you are and what natural resources you've got.
But there must be some other elements, like does politics come into play? Because the physics is easy. If you've got a normal conventional power station, you burn stuff, it's about 30% efficient. Whatever you chuck in at one end, you get 30% out the other end as electricity. That's the rules of physics apply everywhere. So what's different between each country?
Well, it's when you get into politics. It's politics. It's political decisions which make a difference
politics.
anyway. Everything's politics, but particularly in energy, as you know. So, if you build a lot of cheap onshore wind, you have cheap renewable power, which we did for a long time, and that is the lowest cost renewable power. It's still cheaper than solar, but then we stopped it. So we built offshore wind.
Which was a pure political decision.
It was, but we then went to offshore wind, which is much more expensive. Nuclear. How fast can you build it? We have an incredibly sort of ossified, slow, expensive system for building nuclear. So it takes us best part of 30 years from going, oh, I feel like a nuclear power station, to actually having one
Do you
built.
often feel like a nuclear power station?
I feel like I like a few, but I just don't have the time.
Yeah.
But then in other countries, they decide to do it faster. In China, they've got 26 reactors under construction at the moment, and they're getting on with it with their own homegrown designs that are all standardized and very fast. We talk about small modular reactors, where they've got large modular reactors. They're all the same, and they're pumping them out. Or in Abu Dhabi, they said, give me some nuclear, and it was about, I think, soup to nuts 10 years. In reality, people say it was 6 years. It wasn't really, but they had no issues in planning. They just said they wanted it, and they got the Koreans in, who are brilliant, and built it very, very, very fast. So you've got those political decisions as well. It then goes on to market structure. So that's a complicated one. It's how you set the price. So
how people buy and sell, what the rules are, things like that?
What the rules are.
Right,
so
okay.
the easiest way is in a lot of in parts of America, what they do is basically they take all of the costs of electricity in a year in a state, right? The cost of the power station, the amortization, how much of the build cost.
So building it, running it,
but you add it.
else.
It's the cost of the power stations, it's the cost of running them in that year, and it's the cost of fuel, and it's the cost of the grid, and they divide it essentially by everybody, and you get the price. That's a simplification, but it's broadly how it works. We don't have that in the UK, so we have a wholesale market, and we have something that's it's an economist's wet dream, right? So what happens is there's a clearing price of the last, bear with me, listeners, on this. It's the last megawatt hour sets the clearing price. So the idea is that there's an auction. Jump in where I'm getting this completely wrong, but there's basically an auction in every half hour for the power on the system, and it goes cheaper until you get the last one you need, and that's the last one that gets the highest price because it's bid in the highest price. Right, more or less, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the economists
as it
love
becomes
this.
more scarce or more vital, the price goes up.
Yes.
When they used to have what they called a spot market, it actually used to be worth doing something called peak lopping, which was actually starting generators to avoid importing expensive electricity. So buying and paying for generators yourself rather than take it off the grid. That's what happens when you get variation in price.
Yeah, but the idea of this is a good one. Because what it does is it incentivizes two things. One, cheap generation, because the cheaper you are, the more profit you make, right? And secondly, it stops scarcity because everyone knows that the last bit of power gets a high price. So you build out a bigger grid that means that you reach the peaks and you're encouraging cheaper power. So the economists got very excited, like this is beautiful. But what they then realized, or what not what they realized, but what happened is with the build out of renewables and zero marginal price generation, is that it dumps money on people on cheap generators way too much. So right now, if you're generating solar, or if you're lucky to be generating solar in a period where there isn't that much solar and the price is high, you can get paid £100 a megawatt hour for something that's costing you virtually nothing at all. And this happened a lot in the aftermath of the Ukraine war because the gas price was very high. So the last bit of generation coming on the system to meet that demand was gas. They needed a very high price going into the hundreds of pounds, sometimes thousands, in order to keep the system stable. But that set the price for everybody else. So the cheap generators were sitting there and they were like, boys, I was only expecting 50 quid a megawatt hour. That's all I need. But I'm getting sometimes up to 3,000. The problem is everybody pays for that. So that system right now is no longer fit for purpose. So there are two ways you deal with this. You can split the market between renewables and non-renewables because they're very different. And you can do zonal pricing.
So you're splitting between winter and summer, really, because like renewables will be really cheap in the summer because you've got the added solar. In the winter, you're basically left with wind and not much solar. So the price will go up relatively.
Yeah, but it's always been different winter and summer. I mean, people don't see that in your electricity bills, but the wholesale markets definitely do.
Yeah.
It's kind of
the coal-fired power stations are the same all the time.
Yeah. But you've always had cheaper power in the summer because there's less demand.
Yeah.
It's been more expensive in the winter, but that is getting more extreme. But what the government's done is done contracts for difference, basically given a flat price to renewables. It's not a perfect system, but it kind of gets them out of that wholesale market and says, this is the price you need to build it. It's fair. You're getting a return on your investment.
So they're just trying to control variations in the price by taking some risk out.
And they're taking it out of the market.
Yeah.
The other thing that's a big debate at the moment is zonal pricing. So you have different prices depending where you are generating electricity.
Right. But surely it should be based on where the consumer is rather than where the...
Well, if you've got Scotland, they're producing a huge
They've
amount
got
of
loads
power,
of electricity in North Scotland when the wind blows.
which is not very useful.
But we're using it all in southern England.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of political controversy at the moment about turning off wind farms, inverted commas, paying people to turn off wind farms. And it's an inefficient use of the system. But the argument is that it's cheaper to do that than to build out a massive grid that uses every last bit of generation. And that the other zonal argument is build generation close to where people are using it, so you need less long distance grid to power your factory.
But then surely it would make sense to start moving all the steel industry to northern Scotland.
Yeah, well, it would from a power price point of view, but it's just not going to happen. I mean, that's the zonal pricing. People say, yeah, we'll move industry to Scotland because power will be cheap. I don't know.
Well, over the long term period of the existence of anything, the capital cost of building an energy intensive process is minuscule compared to the cost of running the process.
Yeah.
So if you, rather than doing the accountancy thing, like you can think 3/4 of the year ahead if you're really brave, but normally you'd like to focus on a quarter of the year. If you actually think about the lifetime of what you're building, the savings of taking your process to the energy are huge, absolutely huge.
But it goes back to our point about, your physical inheritance of the natural resources you've got. But let's, I think it's worth talking about electricity bills and what they're made up of, because people think that it's all energy, but it's not.
Yeah, I hold my hand up guilty here. I used to be in a relatively senior position in one of the big six energy companies, and they are basically a pass-through business. I mean, we had our organisation build £3.75 billion worth of energy a year, but we only actually 5% of that passed across the desk was ours to play with, to run
5% of profit, that's all right.
No, not
5%, 3
5%
billion.
profit, 5% to run the business. So we would make a 20% profit margin on 5%. So basically we're making 1%. So out of your £100 energy bill, your energy company gets £1
So you're not evil.
profit.
You're not evil. The energy companies aren't evil.
No, the thing about energy bills is they're made up of so much more than your energy. Politically in the UK, we made a decision to make electricity a tax point, right? So you pay all sorts of other charges.
But it's about, I mean, let's break it down. It's roughly half is the actual energy.
Yeah,
Give or take.
the generation, the energy, paying for the power stations,
Yeah.
all of that sort of malarkey. Yeah.
About a quarter is the grid, maybe not quite, but around that.
Yeah.
Getting the energy around the system, that's genuinely expensive.
Yeah, delivering it, basically, yeah.
And about a quarter is taxes and charges for green power.
Yes. The thing is, the government could make a decision to change the tax point over to gas. But because we use roughly 3 or 4 times as much gas, especially in the domestic environment, than electricity in terms of your actual kilowatt hours, that would impact people very, very detrimentally. Because if you started putting it on a kilowatt hour of gas, when you think that, you know, what I'm saying is every time you use 100 kilowatts in your house on average during the year, 25 kilowatts are spent on what you see, cooking your food, putting your lights on, running your TV, charging the kids' phones, all of that sort of stuff. 3/4 of it is fundamentally keeping you warm. Out of the gas, it's something like 1% of gas is spent on cooking, 10 to 15% is spent on hot water, and all the rest is space heating.
Yeah, and there's a problem there because there's, in my opinion, too many taxes on electricity, not enough on gas, and that means that, you know, when you want people to move to electric heating, to heat pumps, it actually, the economics are not quite the same because your electricity is relatively a heck of a lot more expensive than the gas, and it means the heat pump doesn't make as much sense. If you evened out the taxation, heat pumps would be a much better investment in the UK.
Exactly. But I tell you what would suddenly become very popular is insulation. We have a rubbish housing stock, right? Housing stock is split in about 3 pieces in the UK. There's the sort of pre-war type properties, and I mean, like, you know, the stuff that's nearly 100 years old,
Like
which is nearly, which is about 1/3 of the stock, which is built before building regulations. Some of it hasn't got foundations or insulation or anything, and in that is like Windsor Castle and other such things.
Sure.
Then there's the bit in the middle, which is basically the Second World War till about 1970, 1975, when you got all the houses built with huge great glass windows, like 1960s stuff with Crittall windows in that have got metal frames, and they used to leak heat all over the place.
Yeah, because energy was so cheap, no one really
and that
thought
was
about
the
it.
era of coal fires. And then you've got the post-1970 stuff from the sort of the most recent oil crises. That's when they started to bring building regulations in about insulation and whatever. So only basically 1/3 of our housing stock is even remotely connected to the real world as it exists now. And all the rest throws heat out like it's going out of fashion.
And the various governments they've tried to put insulation on your energy bill, and it's never really worked. It's really hard to do. So to summarise, you know, in the UK, the reason electricity costs so much is we're not blessed with the most amazing natural resources. We've made some pretty dodgy political decisions from time to time, like not having
Only
much
some.
onshore wind. And we've got a really complex market structure that means we've got a price set by gas that probably means we're paying too much for a lot of our electricity most of the time.
But some of that is fixable politically and socially.
Something's fixable politically.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a review. It really helps us grow and continue bringing you valuable content. If you're curious to learn more about Beaverbrook Energy and how we're navigating the future of energy, feel free to reach out to us directly. We appreciate you listening, and we look forward to having you join us again next time. Stay informed, stay engaged, and take care.